The rain hammered against Jake Morrison's windshield like bullets of ice, each drop exploding into 1,000 smaller fragments before the wipers could sweep them away. His ancient pickup truck groaned as it climbed the steep hill on Route 47, the engine making that familiar wheezing sound that meant another expensive repair was lurking just around the corner. The heater had given up 3 winters ago, and now Jake pulled his worn denim jacket tighter around his shoulders, his breath visible in small puffs of white vapor. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was past 11 on a Tuesday night in October, and the mountain roads outside Millbrook were as empty as his wallet. Jake had just finished his second shift at the lumber mill, where he stacked boards and loaded trucks for 12 hours straight, his hands raw and aching by the time the whistle blew. Tomorrow he'd be back at 6 in the morning, then off to his weekend job at Murphy's Auto Repair, where he spent Saturdays lying under strangers' cars, his back screaming against concrete floors that never seemed to warm up. The math was simple and brutal. 2 jobs barely covered rent on the tiny apartment he shared with his 8-year-old son, Tommy. There was nothing left for the things that mattered. The things that made a childhood worth remembering. No birthday parties at the pizza place, no new sneakers when the old ones split at the seams, no field trips that cost $20 he didn't have. Just the grinding routine of survival, one paycheck away from disaster. Jake's phone buzzed. Against the passenger seat, the screen lighting up with a text from Mrs. Henderson, Tommy's babysitter. "Tommy asked when you're coming home. He saved you half his sandwich." The words hit harder than they should have. His boy was growing up, in the spaces between Jake's exhaustion, learning to be patient in ways no 8-year-old should have to master. That's when he saw the headlights. They were wrong somehow. Instead of the steady beam of a car traveling the road, these lights swayed and jerked like a wounded animal trying to find its footing. Jake slowed his truck, squinting through the rain-streaked windshield. As he rounded the next curve, the scene unfolded in front of him like a photograph developing in slow motion. A sleek silver car sat sideways across the narrow shoulder, its front end tilted at an odd angle toward the ditch. Steam rose from under the hood in ghostly spirals, and the hazard lights blinked in a frantic rhythm that seemed to pulse with desperation. Behind the wheel, barely visible through the tinted windows, was the silhouette of someone slumped forward, motionless. Jake pulled over without thinking, his truck's tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. He grabbed the flashlight from his glove compartment, the same heavy-duty maglite he'd carried since his days in the army, before Tommy was born, before everything fell apart. The rain soaked through his jacket within seconds, cold fingers of water finding every gap in the fabric, but he barely noticed. As he approached the disabled car, he could see it was expensive. Not just nice, but the kind of expensive that came with heated seats and a price tag that could feed his family for 6 months. The license plate frame bore the logo of a luxury dealership 3 towns over, the kind of place where Jake's truck would look like a rusted relic in a museum of automotive evolution. He tapped gently on the driver's side window, his knuckles making a soft drumming sound against the glass. The figure inside stirred, and slowly the window rolled down with the smooth electric hum of German engineering. What he saw made him take a step back, not from fear, but from surprise. The woman behind the wheel couldn't have been much older than 30, with auburn hair that had escaped from what must have once been a neat bun, now hanging in damp strands around her face. Her eyes were wide with exhaustion, and something that looked like panic barely held in check. She wore a navy blue suit that probably cost more than Jake made in a month, but it was wrinkled and stained with what looked like coffee, and her white blouse had a small tear near the shoulder. "Are you hurt?" Jake asked, raising his voice. Over the sound of rain drumming against metal, his breath created small clouds in the cold air between them. She shook her head, but he could see her hands trembling as they gripped the steering wheel. "I think something's wrong with the car. It just started making this horrible noise, and then the engine light came on, and I pulled over, but now it won't start at all." Her voice carried the crisp accent of education and privilege, but underneath it was something raw and desperate. Jake nodded toward the hood. "Mind if I take a look?" The woman hesitated for a moment, and Jake could almost see the calculations running through her mind. Here was a stranger on a dark road, a man in work clothes and calloused hands asking to look under the hood of her expensive car. But desperation has a way of making decisions easier. "Please," she said, and there was something in that single word that told Jake this was about more than just a broken car. He walked around to the front of the vehicle, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. When she popped the hood, a small cloud of steam escaped with a hissing sound that spoke of overheated metal and mechanical distress. Jake leaned in, his trained eye immediately finding the problem. The radiator hose had split, probably from age and the stress of the cold rain hitting hot metal. Coolant had leaked out in a steady stream, leaving dark stains on the asphalt beneath the car. It wasn't a complicated repair, but it was the kind of thing that would leave someone stranded if they didn't know what they were looking for. "Your radiator hose is blown," Jake called out, his voice carrying over the sound of rain. "That's why she overheated. The good news is it's fixable. The bad news is not here, not tonight, not without the right parts." The woman got out of the car, and Jake could see she was shorter than he'd expected, maybe 5'4" in heels that were completely impractical for standing on a wet mountain road. She walked over to where he stood, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. "How long would it take to fix?" she asked, and Jake heard the edge of something urgent in her voice. "With the right hose and some tools, maybe 20 minutes, but we'd need to get it to a shop and nothing's open until morning." Jake studied her face in the flashlight beam. "Is there someone you can call? Family, maybe?" Something flickered across her expression, quick as lightning but unmistakable. Pain, maybe, or anger. "No," she said simply. "There's no one." Jake felt that familiar tug in his chest, the same one that had gotten him into trouble more times than he could count. It was the part of him that couldn't walk past a stray dog or ignore a neighbor's broken fence. The part that had made him stop for a stranger on a dark road, even when he was already late getting home to his son. "Look," he said, "there's a motel about 5 miles back down the mountain. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and warm. I could give you a ride there, and in the morning I can come back with my tools and the parts you need. Won't charge you for the labor, just the cost of the hose." The woman stared at him for a long moment, and Jake could almost hear the thoughts racing through her mind. He was a stranger offering help to another stranger, and in today's world, that kind of kindness was rare enough to be suspicious. "Why would you do that?" she asked finally. Jake shrugged, rain dripping from the brim of his baseball cap. "Because if my truck broke down and I was stranded with my son, I'd hope someone would help us." Something in her expression softened then, and she nodded. "Okay, thank you. I'm Sarah, by the way. Sarah Chen." "Jake Morrison." He extended his hand, and when she shook it, he noticed her grip was firm despite the trembling. "Let me help. You get your things." As Sarah gathered her purse and a small overnight bag from the back seat, Jake found himself wondering what had brought a woman in an expensive suit to this particular stretch of mountain road at nearly midnight on a Tuesday. It wasn't the kind of route you took by accident. Route 47 was a shortcut that only locals knew about, a winding path through the hills that could save you 30 minutes if you were trying to get from the valley to the interstate without going. Through downtown traffic, Sarah locked her car and followed Jake to his truck, her heels clicking against the wet asphalt. When she opened the passenger door, Jake saw her pause for a moment, taking in the cracked vinyl seats and the duct tape, holding the dashboard together. But she climbed in without comment, settling her bag on the floor and buckling her seatbelt. The inside of Jake's truck smelled like sawdust and motor oil, with an undertone of the pine air freshener that hung from the rearview mirror. It was a working man's vehicle, built for function rather than comfort, and Jake felt a moment of embarrassment as he started the engine. The heater coughed to life, producing a thin stream of lukewarm air that was barely better than nothing. "Sorry about the heat," Jake said as he pulled back onto the road. "She's got a few miles on her." Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around herself. "It's fine, better than sitting in the rain." They drove in silence for the first few minutes. The only sounds, the rhythmic thump of windshield wipers and the steady hum of tires on wet pavement. Jake found himself stealing glances at his passenger, trying to piece together the story that had led her to this moment. Her clothes suggested money, but there was something fragile about the way she held herself, like someone who was used to being in control, but had recently discovered that control was an illusion. "Can I ask what brings you out this way so late?" Jake said finally, his voice careful and non-intrusive. Sarah was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was at a deposition, a legal thing. It ran later than expected, and I thought I could make it back to the city tonight instead of staying over." She paused, staring out the passenger window at the dark shapes of trees rushing past. "I should have taken the main highway, but I wanted to avoid the traffic, and someone told me this was faster." Jake nodded. "It is, usually, but these mountain roads can be tricky, especially when the weather turns." "Story of my life," Sarah said with a bitter laugh. "Take the shortcut, end up more lost than when you started." There was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't just talking about roads, and Jake felt that familiar urge to ask more questions, to understand what was really happening. But he'd learned over the years that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was simply listen without pushing. The Pineview Motel appeared around the next bend, its neon sign casting a pale, blue glow through the rain. It was the kind of place that had seen better decades, but Jake knew from experience that the rooms were clean and the owner, Mrs. Kowalski, was honest about the rates. He pulled into the gravel parking lot and cut the engine. "This is it," he said. "Nothing fancy, but Mrs. K keeps the place nice." Sarah looked through the windshield at the modest one-story building with its row of numbered doors and small windows glowing with warm yellow light. "It looks perfect," she said, and Jake was surprised to hear what sounded like genuine relief in her voice. They walked to the office together, Jake's work boots crunching on gravel, while Sarah's heels made sharp clicking sounds that echoed off the building's brick walls. The office was small and overheated, with wood-paneled walls covered in faded photographs of local landmarks and a coffee pot that looked like it had been brewing the same pot since the Clinton administration. Mrs. Kowalski emerged from the back room, a round woman in her 70s with steel-grey hair and the kind of no-nonsense expression that came from 40 years of dealing with travelers at all hours. She looked from Jake to Sarah with curious but kind eyes. "Evening, Jake," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent of her Polish childhood. "Little late for you to be out, isn't it?" "Car trouble," Jake explained. "Sarah here needs a room for the night. I'll be back in the morning to fix her car." Mrs. Kowalski nodded and pulled a registration card from beneath the counter. "Room 7 is available. Clean sheets, hot shower, and the heater works good." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She quoted a rate that was reasonable by any standard and generous by the standards of someone stranded on a mountain road. As Sarah filled out the registration card, Jake noticed her handwriting was precise and controlled. Each letter formed with the kind of care that suggested attention to detail was second nature. Under home address, she wrote a street name in the city that Jake recognized as being in the expensive part of town, where houses had circular driveways and lawns maintained by professional services. "I'll pick you up around 8 tomorrow morning," Jake said, as Mrs. Kowalski handed Sarah a key attached to a plastic tag shaped like a pine tree. "Should have you back on the road by 9:30 at the latest." Sarah turned to face him, and in the harsh fluorescent light of the motel office, Jake could see dark circles under her eyes that spoke of more than just one sleepless night. "I can't thank you enough for this, really. Most people would have just driven past." Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude that felt larger than the simple act of helping a stranded motorist. Most people are good folks. They just don't always get the chance to show it. As they walked back outside, the rain had softened to a light drizzle that hung in the air like mist. Sarah stopped at the door to room 7 and turned back to Jake. "The repair," she said. "What will it cost?" "Parts are maybe $30–40. Like I said, no charge for the work." Sarah shook her head. "That's not right. Your time is worth something." Jake was about to argue when he saw something in her expression that told him this was important to her, that being able to pay her own way was about more than just money. "Okay," he said. "50 total, parts and labor." Sarah nodded, satisfied. 8 o'clock tomorrow." 8 o'clock. Jake waited until he heard the deadbolt click into place before walking back to his truck. As he drove the winding road home, he found himself thinking about the woman he'd just left at the Pineview Motel. There had been something about her that stuck with him, something beyond the obvious fact that she was beautiful and clearly out of place on a mountain road in the middle of the night. It was the way she'd said, "There's no one," when he'd asked if she could call someone, not, "I don't want to bother anyone," or, "It's too late to call." Just, "There's no one," spoken with the kind of finality that came from experience rather than choice. Jake knew something about being alone. He'd been raising Tommy by himself for 3 years now, ever since Lisa had decided that being a mother was harder than she'd expected and moved back to California with her sister. He knew what it felt like to handle every crisis by yourself, to make every decision without backup, to lie awake at night wondering if you were screwing up the most important job of your life. But Jake had Tommy, and Tommy had him. They were a team, even if it was a team of 2 operating on a shoestring, budget and running on fumes most of the time. Sarah Chen, for all her expensive clothes and luxury car, seemed to be playing the game entirely alone. The apartment Jake shared with Tommy was on the 2nd floor of a converted house on Maple Street, a neighborhood that had seen better days but still maintained a stubborn dignity. Jake climbed the creaky wooden stairs, fishing his keys from his pocket and trying to move quietly so he wouldn't wake Mrs. Henderson, who lived in the apartment below and had been babysitting Tommy since he was 5. The door opened into a small living room that served multiple purposes: homework station, dining room, entertainment center, and Jake's office for paying bills and handling the endless paperwork that seemed to multiply when you weren't looking. The furniture was a mix of second-hand finds and hand-me-downs, but everything was clean and carefully arranged to make the most of the limited space. Tommy was asleep on the couch, curled up under the quilt that Jake's mother had made before. She passed away. A book lay open on his chest, and Jake could see it was one of the Hardy Boys mysteries that Tommy had discovered at the library and become obsessed with. Mrs. Henderson had left a note on the kitchen counter. Tommy did his homework and ate most of his dinner. He stayed up reading, but fell asleep around 10. Sweet dreams, both of you. Jake carefully lifted his son, feeling the familiar weight of the boy's growing body, and carried him to the small bedroom they shared. Tommy stirred but didn't wake as Jake tucked him into the bottom bunk and pulled the covers up to his chin. For a moment, Jake stood there in the darkness, listening to his son's steady breathing and feeling the weight of everything he was trying to provide and everything he was afraid he was failing to give. Tomorrow would bring another day of trying to make the numbers work, another day of choosing between paying the electric bill early or buying groceries that included something more exciting than peanut butter sandwiches and canned soup. Another day of watching Tommy try to be brave about the things they couldn't afford, while other kids his age took those things for granted. But tonight, there had been something different. Jake couldn't explain it, but helping Sarah Chen had felt like more than just fixing a broken radiator hose. It had felt like a reminder that sometimes the universe put people in your path for reasons you couldn't see until later. That sometimes doing the right thing opened doors you didn't even know existed. Jake climbed into the top bunk, still wearing his work clothes because he was too tired to change and too keyed up to sleep immediately. Through the thin walls of the apartment, he could hear Mr. Peterson's television playing the late-night news and the sound of Mrs. Chen's cat prowling the hallway. These were the sounds of his life, the background noise of making do and getting by and trying to build something better one day at a time. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Jake's last thought was of Sarah Chen, alone in room 7 at the Pineview Motel, and the look in her eyes when she'd said there was no one to call. He wondered what kind of story could leave someone so clearly successful, yet so completely isolated, and whether fixing her car might somehow fix something else entirely. The alarm clock beside Jake's bed screamed to life at 5:30 in the morning, its shrill electronic voice cutting through the dream he'd been having about building something with his hands, something important that he couldn't quite remember. Upon waking, Jake rolled out of the top bunk with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been getting up before dawn for years, his feet finding the floor without conscious thought. Tommy was still asleep, his 8-year-old face peaceful in the grey morning light that filtered through the bedroom's single window. Jake had learned to move quietly in the mornings, gathering his work clothes and heading to the bathroom without making the floorboards creak. He had a routine that was economical in both time and motion. Quick shower, instant coffee, 2 pieces of toast with whatever jam was on sale at the grocery store. By 6:15, Jake was dressed and ready to leave for the lumber mill. He left a note for Tommy on the kitchen counter, the same note he left every morning. Cereal in the cupboard, milk in the fridge. Mrs. Henderson will walk you to school. Love you, Dad. P. Be good, work hard, make me proud. The morning shift at Hartwell Lumber began at 6:30 sharp, and Jake had learned that being 5 minutes early was the difference between getting the easier assignments and spending the day wrestling with the heavy hardwood boards that left splinters in your hands and aches in your shoulders. He clocked in alongside the other early crew, men with weathered faces and permanent sawdust in their hair. Men who measured their lives in overtime hours and pension contributions that never seemed to grow fast enough. Jake's supervisor, Bill Martinez, was already reviewing the day's shipping orders when Jake approached the assignment board. Bill was a fair man who had worked his way up from the floor, and he understood that some of his crew had second jobs and families that depended on every hour of overtime they could get. "Morrison," Bill called out, not looking up from his clipboard, "got a special request for you today." Jake felt his stomach tighten. Special requests usually meant either really good news or really bad news, and in his experience, really good. News was as rare as finding money in your old jacket pocket. "What kind of special request?" Jake asked. Bill handed him a work order that was different from the usual shipping manifests. Instead of listing lumber dimensions and delivery addresses, this one had a single-line item: custom millwork consultation, 8 a.m., Chen residence. Jake stared at the paper, reading the address twice to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding. It was the same address he'd seen Sarah Chen write on the motel registration card the night before. "I don't understand," Jake said. "This is scheduled for 8 o'clock, but my shift starts at 6:30. Bill looked up then, and Jake saw something in his expression that might have been amusement. "Chen called the office last night, asked specifically for you by name, said she had an urgent custom project that needed to be handled this morning. She's paying premium rates for the consultation, and she requested that you handle it personally." Jake felt the pieces of a puzzle clicking together, but the picture they formed didn't make complete sense. "She called last night, after I dropped her off at the motel." "Around midnight," Bill confirmed. "Woke up Frank at home. Said it was an emergency consultation that couldn't wait, and that Jake Morrison was the only guy she'd trust with the project." Bill's eyebrows rose slightly. "Care to explain how a lady in a suit and a Mercedes knows a lumber mill grunt by name?" Jake folded the work order and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "I helped her with her car last night. It broke down on Route 47. Bill nodded slowly. "Well, apparently you made quite an impression. She's paying enough for this consultation to cover your whole day's wages, plus overtime. Take the company truck and don't worry about clocking back in until tomorrow." As Jake drove the company pickup truck back up the mountain road he'd traveled twice in the past 12 hours, he found himself trying to make sense of what was happening. Sarah Chen had clearly done some research after he'd left her at the motel. Somehow she'd figured out where he worked and arranged for what sounded like a lucrative custom project consultation. But why? The cynic in Jake wondered if this was some kind of elaborate way to pay him more money for helping with her car, a gesture from someone who was uncomfortable with the idea of accepting help from a stranger. The optimist in Jake, the part of him that had been buried under years of financial stress and single-parent exhaustion, wondered if maybe this was something else entirely. The Chen residence turned out to be everything Jake had expected and more. It sat at the end of a winding private drive, a sprawling contemporary house that seemed to grow out of the mountainside itself. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the morning sky, and the architecture was the kind that appeared effortless, but probably required a team of engineers to achieve. The driveway was paved with stones that looked like they'd been individually selected, and the landscaping was so perfectly maintained it could have been featured in a magazine. Jake parked the lumber mill truck next to Sarah's silver car, which had obviously been towed and repaired since the night before. The radiator hose had been replaced, and the engine bay looked like it had been detailed as well. Professional work, Jake noted, probably done at the luxury dealership where the car had been purchased. Sarah answered the door before Jake had a chance to knock, as if she'd been watching for his arrival. She looked completely different from the stranded motorist he'd encountered 12 hours earlier. Her hair was styled in a sleek bob, and she wore dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Jake's monthly rent. But her eyes held the same expression of carefully controlled vulnerability that he remembered from the night before. "Jake," she said, and her smile seemed genuinely pleased to see him. "Thank you for coming. I know this is probably confusing." Jake gestured toward her car. "I see you got her fixed." Sarah followed his gaze. "AAA came and towed it to the dealership this morning. They had it ready by 7. Oh, she paused, then added, "But that's not why I called your company." She led him through a foyer with polished hardwood floors and into a living room that was larger than Jake's entire apartment. The furniture was the kind that looked like art, all clean lines and expensive fabrics, but somehow the room didn't feel cold or unwelcoming. Through the massive windows, Jake could see a deck that overlooked the valley below, where morning mist was just beginning to lift from the trees. "Can I offer you coffee?" Sarah asked. "I have a machine that does all kinds of fancy things, but I also have regular coffee if you prefer." "Regular coffee sounds great," Jake said, still trying to understand why he was here. Sarah disappeared into what Jake assumed was the kitchen, and he found himself alone in a room that represented a level of wealth he'd only seen in movies. But as he looked more closely, he began to notice details that didn't fit the picture of pristine luxury. There were boxes stacked in one corner, sealed with packing tape and labeled with black marker. The coffee table had water rings on its surface, as if someone had been too distracted to use coasters. Most telling of all, there were no personal photographs anywhere in sight. No family pictures or vacation snapshots, or any of the small touches that usually made a house feel like a home. Sarah returned with 2 mugs of coffee, both in delicate porcelain that Jake was afraid he might break just by holding it. She sat across from him on a leather chair that probably cost more than his truck, and for a moment they just looked at each other. "I owe you an explanation," Sarah said finally. Jake sipped his coffee, which was easily the best he'd ever tasted, and waited for her to continue. "Last night, after you left me at the motel, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what you said, about hoping someone would help if it was you and your son who were stranded." Sarah set her coffee down and leaned forward slightly. "It made me realize that I couldn't remember the last time someone had helped me without wanting something in return." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "I wasn't looking for anything in return." "I know," Sarah said quickly. "That's exactly my point. You helped a complete stranger, and when I offered to pay you more than the repair was worth, you insisted on charging me a fair price. You made sure I was safe and never once asked personal questions or tried to take advantage of the situation." Jake still wasn't sure where this was going, but he sensed that Sarah needed to tell her story in her own way. "I'm a lawyer," Sarah continued. "Corporate law, mostly mergers and acquisitions. I've spent the last 8 years building a practice that represents some of the biggest companies in the state." She gestured around the room. "This house, the car, all of it came from working 70-hour weeks and building a reputation for being the person who gets deals done." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the valley below. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot that there were people in the world who do things just because they're right, not because they lead to bigger billable hours or more prestigious clients." Jake was beginning to understand, but he still didn't see where the lumber mill consultation fit into the picture. Sarah turned back to face him. "I called your company last night because I wanted to hire you for a real project. Not charity, not some elaborate way to overpay you for fixing my car. A genuine job that would pay you what you're worth." She walked over to a desk that Jake hadn't noticed before and pulled out a rolled set of papers. When she spread them on the coffee table, Jake could see they were architectural drawings, detailed plans for what looked like a substantial construction project. "I'm having a workshop built," Sarah said. "A woodworking shop with all the tools and space someone would need to do serious custom work. The architect has the basic structure designed, but I need someone who understands wood and tools and craftsmanship to help with the interior layout and equipment specifications." Jake leaned forward to study the drawings more closely. The workshop was impressive, with plans for both hand tools and industrial equipment, storage for lumber and hardware, and workbenches that were clearly designed by someone who understood the workflow of serious woodworking. "This is beautiful work," Jake said, running his finger along the lines that showed the proposed tool layout. "But I'm just a guy who stacks lumber and fixes cars on the weekend. You need a professional contractor for something like this." Sarah shook her head. "I've talked to 3 contractors already. They all want to sell me the most expensive equipment and the fanciest setup, but none of them seem to understand what it would actually be like to work in the space. You're the first person I've met who works with his hands and cares about doing things right." Jake studied the drawings again, seeing possibilities and improvements that hadn't been obvious at first glance. The architect had done good work, but there were details that could be optimized, workflow improvements that would make the space more efficient and comfortable to work in. "Who's the workshop for?" Jake asked. Sarah hesitated, and Jake saw that familiar flicker of vulnerability cross her face. "Me," she said quietly. "I want to learn woodworking." The confession hung in the air between them like morning mist, delicate and surprising. Jake looked up from the architectural drawings to study Sarah's face, searching for signs that this was some kind of elaborate joke or misunderstanding. But what he saw was genuine nervousness, the expression of someone who had just revealed something important and wasn't sure how it would be received. "You want to learn woodworking," Jake repeated, not as a question, but as a way of letting the idea settle in his mind. Sarah nodded, wrapping her arms around herself in a gesture that reminded Jake of the stranded motorist from the night before. "I know it sounds crazy, a corporate lawyer who works 80-hour weeks wanting to learn to build things with her hands. But I've been thinking about it for months, and last night, after you helped me, I realized I was tired of waiting for someday." Jake set down his coffee mug and leaned back in his chair, trying to process what he was hearing. "What made you interested in woodworking?" Sarah walked back to the window, her fingers tracing patterns on the glass as she spoke. "My grandfather was a carpenter. He built houses, furniture, toys for his grandchildren. When I was little before, my parents divorced and everything got complicated. I used to spend summers with him in his workshop. He taught me how to use a hand plane, how to read the grain in a piece of wood, how to feel when a joint was cut just right." She turned back toward Jake, and he could see that her eyes were bright with the memory of something that had been important to her. He used to say that working with wood was like having a conversation with something that had been growing for decades, that every piece had a story to tell if you knew how to listen. Sarah's voice grew softer. "I haven't thought about those summers in years, but last night, sitting in that motel room, I remembered what it felt like to create something beautiful with my own hands." Jake found himself nodding, understanding more than he'd expected to. "My dad taught me some basic carpentry when I was growing up. Nothing fancy, just how to fix things around the house, how to measure twice and cut once. I always thought maybe someday I'd have the time and space to do more serious woodworking." "What stopped you?" Sarah asked. Jake gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the world beyond this beautiful house where his real life was waiting. "Time, money, space. The usual things. When you're working 2 jobs and raising a kid, hobbies become luxuries you can't afford." Sarah nodded slowly, and Jake saw understanding pass across her face. "That's why I want to hire you," she said. "Not just to help me design the workshop, but to teach me, to be my instructor while I learn the basics." Jake felt his eyebrows rise involuntarily. "You want to pay me to teach you woodworking?" "I want to pay you what a skilled craftsman and instructor is worth," Sarah corrected. "This isn't charity. Jake, I've done my research. Private woodworking instruction from someone with real experience costs between $50 and $75 an hour. Add in consultation on the workshop design and project management for the construction, and we're talking about several months of steady work at professional rates." Jake's mind was racing, trying to calculate what several months of instruction fees would mean for his family's finances. It could be enough to pay off their credit card debt, maybe even save some money for Tommy's college fund. But it felt too good to be true, too much like one of those lottery ticket fantasies that he'd learned not to trust. "Why me?" Jake asked. "You could find someone with better credentials, someone who's actually a professional woodworker." Sarah sat back down across from him, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who had thought this through carefully. "Because you're the first person I've met in years who helped me without wanting anything in return. Because when you looked at my car last night, you didn't see an opportunity to overcharge someone who was desperate. You saw a problem that needed solving, and you solved it fairly and honestly." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've spent 8 years in a world where everyone has an angle, where every conversation is a negotiation and every relationship is transactional. I want to learn something real from someone real, someone who understands that the value of work isn't just measured in money. Jake studied the architectural drawings again, imagining the workshop they represented becoming reality. He could see how the space could be improved, how the tool layout could be optimized for both efficiency and safety. More than that, he could imagine himself in that space, teaching someone else the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional with their own hands. "What about your law practice?" Jake asked. "When would you have time for this?" Sarah's expression darkened slightly, and Jake sensed he'd touched on something painful. "I'm taking a leave of absence," she said quietly, "starting next month. I need some time to figure out." The silence that followed Sarah's words stretched between them like a bridge that neither was quite ready to cross. Jake could see the weight of whatever had led to her decision to take a leave of absence pressing down on her shoulders, making her seem smaller despite the expensive clothes and the confidence that usually came with success. "Personal reasons," Jake asked gently, the same tone he used when Tommy was upset about something at school but wasn't ready to talk about it yet. Sarah nodded, then seemed to catch herself. "Professional burnout, mostly. I haven't taken a real vacation in 3 years, and I realized I was starting to forget why I became a lawyer in the first place." She managed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "My partners weren't thrilled about the timing, but they agreed that 6 months away might help me regain some perspective." Jake sensed there was more to the story, but he also recognized the careful way Sarah was sharing only what she felt comfortable revealing. He'd learned that sometimes the most important conversations happened in the spaces between words, in the things people chose not to say, as much as the things they did. 6 months is a good amount of time to learn the basics, Jake said, returning his attention to the workshop plans. "We could start with hand tools, basic joinery techniques, maybe work up to some simple furniture projects." Sarah's face brightened considerably. "You'll do it?" Jake looked around the living room again, taking in the boxes in the corner and the subtle signs that this house, for all its beauty, felt more like a stopping place than a home. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you planning to stay here, in this house, I mean? If you're taking time away from your practice, are you thinking about making other changes too?" Sarah followed his gaze to the packed boxes, and Jake saw her shoulders tense slightly. "I bought this place 2 years ago as an investment property. The plan was to renovate it and flip it for a profit, but I never got around to the renovation part. I've been living here temporarily while I figured out what I really wanted to do with it." She walked over to one of the boxes and rested her hand on top of it. "These are files from cases I've closed, client records that I'm required to keep. For 7 years. I brought them home because I was working so much that the office was starting to feel more like home than this place." Jake nodded, understanding more than Sarah probably realized. "Tommy and I have lived in our apartment for 3 years, but I still think of it as temporary, like we're just camping there until something better comes along." "Exactly," Sarah said, and there was relief in her voice at being understood. "Except I realized that I've been thinking of everything in my life as temporary. My job, this house, even my relationships. I keep waiting for the real thing to start, but meanwhile years are going by." Jake stood up and walked to the architectural drawings, studying them with fresh eyes. "So the workshop isn't just about learning woodworking, it's about creating something permanent." "Yes," Sarah said simply, "something that belongs to me, that I built with my own hands, that will still be here whether I'm successful or not." Jake found himself thinking about the small projects he'd completed over the years, the bookshelf he'd built for Tommy's room using scrap lumber from the mill, the toy chest he'd made from plans he'd found in an old magazine. None of them were perfect, but they were solid and functional, and they carried the satisfaction of work done with care and attention to detail. "There's something addictive about it," Jake said, more to himself than to Sarah. "Building something that will outlast you." Sarah moved to stand beside him at the table. "Is that why you do it? The carpentry work on weekends?" Jake considered the question. "Partly, but mostly it's because it's the only work I do where I can see the results. At the lumber mill, I load trucks and stack boards, and by the end of the day, there's nothing to show for it except a paycheck. But when I fix someone's fence or build a deck, I can drive by years later and see that it's still there, still doing its job." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I win cases and negotiate deals, and at the end of the day, all I have is a billable hours report and a file that goes into storage. I've never built anything that someone could touch or use or pass down to their children." They spent the next hour going through the workshop plans in detail, with Jake suggesting modifications that would make the space more functional, and Sarah asking questions that showed she'd done considerable research into woodworking techniques and equipment. Jake was impressed by how thoroughly she'd prepared and by how willing she was to listen to suggestions that sometimes contradicted what she'd read in books or seen online. "The architect has this workbench positioned under the window," Jake said, pointing to the main assembly table in the drawings. "That seems like it would be nice, working with natural light, but in practice you'll want your main workspace away from direct sunlight. Too much glare makes it hard to see what you're doing, and the heat from the sun can affect how wood behaves while you're working with it." Sarah made notes in the margins of the plans, her handwriting precise and economical. "What about the tool storage? I've been looking at those fancy cabinet systems, but they're incredibly expensive." Jake smiled. "The expensive systems are beautiful, but you can build better storage for a fraction of the cost. That's actually one of the first projects I'd recommend for a beginner. Design and build your own tool cabinet. You'll learn basic joinery techniques, and you'll end up with storage that's exactly what you need." "That sounds perfect," Sarah said, and Jake could hear genuine excitement in her voice. "How long would something like that take?" "Depends on how elaborate you want to get. A simple cabinet, maybe 2 or 3 weeks working a few hours at a time. Something fancier with hand-cut dovetails and custom hardware could be a month or more." Sarah set down her pen and looked at Jake directly. "Before we go any further, I need to know that you're comfortable with this arrangement. I don't want you to feel like you're accepting charity disguised as work." Jake appreciated the directness of the question. "Can I be honest with you? Please. This job, if we do it, would be life-changing for my family. The money would let me pay off some debts and maybe even save something for Tommy's future. But more than that, it would give me a chance to do work that I actually care about, instead of just grinding through each day trying to make ends meet." Jake paused, making sure he had Sarah's full attention. "But I need you to understand that if we do this, I'm going to treat you like any other student. I won't go easy on you because you're paying well, and I won't pretend something is good. Work when it isn't. If you want to learn woodworking, you're going to have to earn it the same way anyone else would." Sarah's face lit up with something that looked like relief. "That's exactly what I want. I'm tired of people telling me what they think I want to hear. I want to learn something real from someone who won't compromise his standards just because I can afford to pay premium rates." They shook hands then, and Jake was struck by how different Sarah's grip felt from the night before. Last night, her handshake had been firm but desperate, the grasp of someone who was grateful for unexpected help. This morning, her grip was confident and purposeful, the handshake of two professionals entering into a mutually beneficial agreement. "When can we start?" Sarah asked. Jake thought about his schedule at the lumber mill, the weekend shifts at Murphy's Auto Repair, and the endless juggling act of single parenthood. "I can do evenings and weekends, maybe Tuesday and Thursday evenings plus Saturday afternoons." "What about mornings?" Sarah asked. I'm usually up by 5:30 anyway, and I've got nothing but time right now. Jake felt a spark of possibility. Early mornings could work. I start at the mill at 6:30, but if we could meet at 5... He did quick calculations in his head. That would give us an hour and a half, 3 days a week, plus longer sessions on weekends. Perfect, Sarah said. And Jake, thank you. I know this is unusual, and I appreciate you taking a chance on something that probably sounds crazy. Jake gathered up the architectural drawings and rolled them carefully. My dad used to say that the best opportunities usually sound crazy at first. It's only the safe bets that seem reasonable. Indeed, as Jake drove back down the mountain toward town, he found himself thinking about the strange sequence of events that had brought him to this moment. 24 hours ago, he'd been a single father working 2 jobs and struggling to stay ahead of his bills. Now he was potentially looking at months of well-paid work, doing something he actually enjoyed, with someone who seemed to genuinely value what he had to offer. But more than that, there had been something about the conversation with Sarah that had stirred something in Jake that he'd almost forgotten existed. It was the feeling of being seen as more than just a pair of hands or a warm body to fill a shift. Sarah had looked at him and seen someone with knowledge worth paying for, skills worth learning from, and experience worth respecting. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message as he pulled into the lumber mill parking lot. It was from Tommy. Mrs. Henderson says you left early today. Everything okay? Jake smiled as he typed back, everything's fine. Just had an important meeting. Tell you about it tonight. Love you. The rest of Jake's day at the lumber mill passed in a blur of routine. Tasks made more bearable by the knowledge that his circumstances might be about to change significantly. He found himself paying closer attention to the wood that passed through his hands, thinking about grain patterns and moisture content and the dozens of small details that could make the difference between a good project and a great one. Bill. Martinez noticed the change in Jake's demeanor almost immediately. You seem different today, Morrison. That consultation go well? Jake nodded, not wanting to say too much until he was certain the arrangement with Sarah would actually work. Out. It was interesting, might lead to some regular side work. Good for you, Bill said, and Jake could hear genuine warmth in his supervisor's voice. You've been busting your ass here for 3 years without complaining. About time something good came your way. That evening, Jake sat with Tommy at their small kitchen table, helping with homework, while they shared a dinner of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. It was one of Tommy's favorite meals, mostly because it was one of the few things Jake could cook that didn't come from a box or a can. Dad, Tommy said, carefully writing out his spelling words in the precise handwriting that his teacher insisted upon. Mrs. Henderson said, you got a special job today. What kind of special job? Jake considered how to explain the situation in terms that an 8-year-old would understand. I met someone who wants to learn carpentry, and she asked me to teach her. It's the kind of work I really enjoy doing, and it pays better than my regular jobs. Tommy looked up from his homework, pencil still poised over the paper. Does that mean we might have more money? The question hit Jake harder than it should have. He tried to shield Tommy from their financial struggles, but kids were perceptive, and an 8-year-old who had learned to be grateful for hand-me-down clothes and library books instead of toys had obviously figured out that money was tight. It might, Jake said carefully, but we won't know for sure until we see how the work goes. What I can tell you is that if this job works out, it might mean I can spend more time doing work that I really care about. Tommy nodded solemnly, then returned to his spelling words. After a few minutes, he looked up again. Dad, if you make more money, can we maybe get pizza sometime? Not frozen pizza, but real pizza from a restaurant. Jake felt his chest tighten, with a familiar mixture of love and guilt. Yeah, buddy, I think we can probably manage some real pizza. That night, after Tommy had gone to bed, Jake sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and calculator, trying to work out exactly what the arrangement with Sarah might mean for their family's finances. Even conservative estimates suggested that the teaching fees and consultation work could more than double his monthly income for the duration of the project. But more than the money, Jake found himself excited about the prospect of sharing his knowledge with someone who was genuinely eager to learn. He'd always enjoyed the problem-solving aspects of carpentry, the way each project required you to think through challenges and find creative solutions. Teaching Sarah would give him a chance to articulate the things he'd learned through years of trial and error, to pass on not just techniques, but the deeper understanding that came from working with your hands. Jake's phone rang just as he was getting ready for bed. The caller ID showed Sarah's number, and for a moment he worried that she'd had second thoughts about their arrangement. "I hope it's not too late to call," Sarah said when he answered. "I wanted to let you know that I spoke with my contractor this afternoon about modifying the workshop plans based on your suggestions. He said the changes would actually reduce the construction cost and improve the timeline." "That's great news," Jake said, relieved that she was calling about logistics rather than cancellation. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "I've been thinking about our conversation today, about building something permanent. I realized I've never had a mentor before, someone who was willing to teach me something just because I wanted to learn it." Jake settled into the chair by the kitchen window, looking out at the streetlight that illuminated the small patch of yard behind their building. "I've never been anyone's mentor before. It'll be a learning experience for both of us." "I'm looking forward to it," Sarah said, and Jake could hear sincerity in her voice. "Oh, and Jake, I wanted to ask about your son, Tommy, right? Would he be interested in learning some basic woodworking too? I know he's young, but I thought maybe some simple projects with hand tools." Jake felt surprised by the suggestion, but pleasantly so. He'd probably love that. "He's always been curious about the projects I work on at home." "Great," Sarah said. "I'll make sure the workshop has a space that's appropriate for a child to work safely. Maybe we can make this a family learning experience." After they hung up, Jake found himself thinking about the unexpected turn his life had taken in the span of a single day. This morning, he'd been a lumber mill worker with a side business fixing cars. Tonight, he was planning to become a woodworking instructor with a student who wanted to include his son in the learning process. Jake walked quietly into the bedroom he shared with Tommy and climbed into the top bunk, listening to his son's steady, breathing in the darkness below. For the first time in months, maybe years, he went to sleep thinking about possibilities rather than problems, about building something new rather than just maintaining what already existed. The next morning, Jake woke up 15 minutes before his alarm, feeling more rested than he had in weeks. As he got ready for another day at the lumber mill, he found himself paying attention to details he usually overlooked. The way the early morning light hit the kitchen window, the sound of Mrs. Chen's cat purring in the hallway, the smell of coffee brewing in the apartment downstairs. It occurred to Jake that for the first time since Lisa had left, he was looking forward to something beyond just getting through the day. The arrangement with Sarah represented more than just extra income or interesting work. It represented the possibility that his life could contain something more than survival, that there might be room for growth and learning and the satisfaction that came from doing work that mattered. At the lumber mill, Jake found himself studying the wood with new eyes, thinking about how different species would behave under various working conditions, what projects would be appropriate for a beginner, and how to structure lessons that would build skills progressively. Bill Martinez noticed him examining a stack of cherry boards with unusual intensity. "Planning your next weekend project?" Bill asked. Jake looked up, realizing he'd been lost in thought. "Something like that, just trying to learn more about the materials." Bill nodded approvingly. That's what separates the good carpenters from the guys who just know how to use tools. Understanding the wood is half the battle. The comment stayed with Jake throughout the day, reminding him that he had accumulated more knowledge than he sometimes gave himself credit for. Years of working with different types of lumber, combined with weekend projects and repairs, had given him an intuitive understanding of how wood behaved, what tools worked best for specific tasks, and how to troubleshoot problems when projects didn't go according to plan. By the time his shift ended, Jake had mentally outlined the first few lessons he would teach Sarah, starting with wood selection and basic tool maintenance, then moving on to fundamental techniques like measuring, marking, and making straight cuts. He wanted to build her confidence gradually while establishing good habits that would serve her well as she took on more complex projects. Jake's phone buzzed as he was driving home from work. It was a text from Sarah. Contractor says, workshop will be ready in 2 weeks. Can we start with some theory lessons before then? Maybe at your place or a neutral location? Jake considered the suggestion as he pulled into his parking space behind the apartment building. His workshop space consisted of a corner of the basement where he kept his tools and worked on small projects when the weather was too bad to work outside. It wasn't much, but it would be adequate for demonstrating basic techniques and tool usage. He texted back, "My basement workshop is pretty basic, but we could start there. Are you sure you want to begin before your shop is ready?" Sarah's response came quickly. "I've been reading about woodworking for weeks, but I want to actually touch some tools and see how they work. Theory is good, but I learn better by doing." Jake smiled as he climbed the stairs to his apartment. Sarah's eagerness reminded him of Tommy when he was excited about a new book or a science project. There was something infectious about that kind of enthusiasm, and Jake found himself looking forward to their first lesson with an anticipation he hadn't felt about work in years. Tommy was waiting at the kitchen table with his homework spread out in front of him, but Jake could tell his son's mind was somewhere else entirely. "Dad," Tommy said before Jake had even taken off his jacket, "I was thinking about what you said yesterday, about teaching someone carpentry. Could I maybe watch sometimes? I promise I wouldn't get in the way." Jake sat down across from his son and helped him organize his math worksheets. "Actually, the person I'm going to be teaching said she'd like you to be involved. She wants to learn alongside someone who's starting from the beginning, too." Tommy's eyes widened. "Really? I could learn real carpentry?" "Real carpentry," Jake confirmed. "Starting with the basics, learning how to use tools safely, understanding how wood works. It'll be like having our own little apprenticeship program." Tommy practically bounced in his chair with excitement. "When do we start? What are we going to build first? Can I have my own tools?" Jake laughed at his son's rapid-fire questions. "Slow down there, buddy. We'll start simple with basic hand tools and small projects. And yes, if you stick with it and show that you can be responsible, we'll get you some tools of your own." As they worked through Tommy's homework together, Jake found himself thinking about the unexpected ways life could change direction. A broken radiator hose on a mountain road had led to a job opportunity that could transform not just his financial situation, but his entire relationship with work and purpose. More than that, it had created an opportunity to share something meaningful with his son, to pass on skills and knowledge that could serve Tommy well, regardless of what career path he eventually chose. That evening, after Tommy had gone to bed, Jake spent some time in the basement organizing his tools and thinking about how to structure the lessons he would teach. His workshop was modest compared to what Sarah was having built, but it contained the essential hand tools and a few power tools that would be sufficient for demonstrating basic techniques. Jake's collection had been accumulated slowly over the years, with tools purchased when he could afford them and inherited from his father and grandfather. Each chisel and plane and saw carried the patina of use and the accumulated wisdom of multiple generations of men who had worked with their hands. Teaching Sarah and Tommy would be a way of passing on not just the tools themselves, but the knowledge and respect for craftsmanship that came with them. Jake's phone rang just as he was heading upstairs for the night. It was Sarah again, and this time she sounded slightly hesitant. "I hope I'm not calling too late again," she said. "I wanted to run something by you before our first lesson." "What's on your mind?" Jake asked. "I've been thinking about payment structure," Sarah said. "I don't want there to be any awkwardness about money, so I'd like to pay you in advance for blocks of lessons. Would that work for you?" Jake appreciated her directness about financial arrangements. "That sounds reasonable. How many lessons were you thinking?" "I was thinking we could start with a month's worth, 12 lessons at the rate we discussed. That would give us both a chance to see how the arrangement works before committing to anything longer term." Jake did quick mental arithmetic. 12 lessons at the rate they'd agreed upon would provide more financial breathing room than his family had enjoyed in years. "That works for me," he said. "Great. I'll have a check ready for our first lesson. Oh, and Jake, I wanted you to know that I've never been this excited about learning something new. I actually have trouble falling asleep because I keep thinking about all the projects I want to eventually build." Jake smiled, remembering the feeling of discovering a new skill or technique that opened up possibilities he hadn't imagined before. "That's exactly how you should feel. Some of my best learning happened when I was too excited to sleep." After they hung up, Jake walked through his small apartment with fresh eyes, seeing it not as a temporary stopping place, but as home to a family whose circumstances were about to improve significantly. The cramped kitchen, where he and Tommy shared meals, the living room that doubled as homework space and entertainment center, the bedroom where they slept in bunk beds because there wasn't room for separate beds. All of it felt different when viewed through the lens of possibility rather than limitation. Jake fell asleep that night thinking about the workshop Sarah was having built, imagining the smell of fresh wood shavings and the sound of hand tools cutting clean joints. But more than that, he thought about the look on Tommy's face when his son realized he was going to learn real skills that could serve him throughout his life. For the first time since becoming a single father, Jake felt like he had something genuinely valuable to pass on to his son, something more substantial than just the determination to keep working, no matter how hard things got. The next morning brought the first real test of Jake's new role as instructor. Sarah arrived at his apartment building at exactly 7 o'clock, dressed in jeans and a work shirt that looked like they'd been purchased specifically for the occasion. She carried a notebook and what appeared to be a new pencil case approaching. The lesson with the same level of preparation she probably brought to important legal cases. "I brought Tommy a gift," Sarah said, as Jake led her down to the basement workshop. "I hope that's okay." She handed Jake a small canvas tool roll tied with leather cord. When he opened it, he found a set of basic hand tools sized for a child. A small hammer, a few chisels, a marking gauge, and a folding ruler. The tools were real, not toys, but appropriately sized for small hands. "These are beautiful," Jake said, running his fingers over the smooth wooden handles. "He's going to be thrilled." Tommy appeared at the top of the basement stairs in his pajamas, having apparently been listening for Sarah's arrival. "Is she here? Can I come down?" "Get dressed first," Jake called back, "and brush your teeth. We'll wait for you." While Tommy got ready, Jake showed Sarah around his modest workshop, explaining the function of different tools and the projects he'd completed over the years. Sarah asked thoughtful questions and took notes, clearly trying to absorb as much information as possible. "This is exactly what I was hoping for," Sarah said, examining the workbench that Jake had built from plans in an old magazine. "Something real and functional, not just pretty to look at." Tommy bounded down the stairs 5 minutes later, dressed and ready for his first carpentry lesson. When Jake presented him with the tool roll, the boy's reaction was everything Sarah could have hoped for. "These are mine?" Tommy asked, carefully examining each tool. "Real tools, not pretend ones?" "Real tools," Sarah confirmed. "But remember, real tools can be dangerous if you don't use them properly. Your dad is going to teach us both how to be safe and responsible." Jake felt a warm satisfaction as he watched his son handle the tools with appropriate reverence and curiosity. This was what he'd hoped to share with Tommy someday. The understanding that tools were not just objects, but extensions of your hands and mind, instruments for turning ideas into reality. The first lesson focused on wood selection and grain orientation, with Jake explaining how to read the patterns in different species and predict how they would behave when cut or shaped. Sarah and Tommy both proved to be attentive students, asking questions that showed they were thinking about the implications of what they were learning. "So if I want to make a cutting board," Sarah said, studying a piece of maple that Jake had selected for demonstration, "I should orient the grain so that the knife cuts across it rather than with it." "Exactly," Jake said. "End grain cutting. Boards are harder on knives, but easier on the wood. Face grain boards are easier on knives, but show cut marks more readily. Edge grain is usually the best compromise for most applications." Tommy raised his hand like he was in school. "Dad, what happens if you cut the grain the wrong way?" Jake showed them a piece of pine with a split that ran along the grain line. "Sometimes the wood will split where you don't want it to. Other times it might tear out instead of cutting cleanly. Part of learning woodworking is understanding how to work with the wood instead of fighting against it." By the end of the hour-and-a-half lesson, both Sarah and Tommy had successfully made their first cuts with hand saws, learned to use a marking gauge to scribe lines, and understood the basic principles of measuring twice and cutting once. Jake was impressed by how quickly they both picked up the fundamental concepts and how seriously they approached the safety protocols he insisted upon. "Next lesson, we'll start working on actual joints," Jake said, as they cleaned up the workspace. "Maybe some simple finger joints or basic dados, nothing too complicated, but enough to give you a feel for how pieces fit together." Sarah nodded enthusiastically while Tommy carefully returned his new tools to their canvas roll. "This is exactly what I was hoping for," Sarah said. "Learning something completely new, using my hands in ways I never have before." As Jake walked Sarah to her car, she handed him an envelope containing payment for the first month of lessons. "I can't thank you enough for including Tommy in this. I know it probably makes the lessons more complicated, but seeing his excitement reminds me why learning new skills is so important." "He's actually a great student," Jake said. "Kids usually learn faster than adults because they don't have preconceived notions about what's possible or impossible." Sarah smiled as she got into her car. "Maybe I should try to think more like an 8-year-old then. See you Thursday?" "Thursday," Jake confirmed, watching as she drove away. Back in the basement, Jake found Tommy carefully arranging his new tools on the workbench, making sure each one was positioned exactly where it would be easy to reach. "Dad," Tommy said without looking up from his organizing, "this is the best thing that's ever happened to us, isn't it?" Jake considered the question seriously. "It's definitely one of the best things. But Tommy, remember that good things can change just as quickly as bad things. We need to work hard and be grateful for the opportunity, but not count on it lasting forever." Tommy nodded solemnly, then looked up at his father with the kind of direct gaze that 8-year-olds sometimes used when they were about to say something important. "Dad, I think Sarah is lonely like we used to be. Maybe teaching us makes her feel less lonely, like having us helps her feel like she belongs somewhere." Jake felt surprised by his son's perceptive observation. Tommy was right. There had been something in Sarah's demeanor during the lesson that suggested she was enjoying not just the learning, but the simple pleasure of being part of something, of having a place where she was expected and welcomed. "You might be right about that, buddy," Jake said. "I think maybe we're all helping each other in different ways." As Jake tucked Tommy into bed that night, his son was still talking excitedly about the tools and techniques they'd learned, already planning projects he wanted to build and skills he wanted to master. Jake listened with the contentment that came from seeing his child genuinely excited about learning something meaningful, something that could serve him well throughout his life, regardless of what career path he eventually chose. But as Jake turned off the lights and headed to his own bed, he found himself thinking about Tommy's observation about Sarah being lonely. There had been moments during the lesson when Jake had caught glimpses of vulnerability beneath Sarah's competent exterior. Suggestions that for all her professional success and financial security, she was missing some of the basic human connections that made life meaningful. Jake realized that in focusing on how much the arrangement could help his family, he hadn't fully considered how much Sarah might need what they were offering in return. Teaching her woodworking wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity to provide something that couldn't be purchased or negotiated or achieved through professional accomplishment. It was the chance to be part of a community, even if that community consisted of just a single father and his 8-year-old son sharing their knowledge in a basement workshop. As Jake drifted off to sleep, he found himself looking forward to Thursday's lesson with an anticipation that had nothing to do with money or career advancement. For the first time in years, he was excited about the simple prospect of sharing something he cared about with people who genuinely wanted to learn. It was a feeling he'd almost forgotten existed, and rediscovering it felt like finding a part of himself that he hadn't realized was missing. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Jake arrived at the construction site where Sarah's workshop was taking shape to find her sitting on a stack of lumber, tears streaming down her face. She quickly wiped her eyes when she saw his truck pulling up the gravel driveway, but not quickly enough to hide the fact that something had gone seriously wrong. The partially completed building looked exactly as Jake had expected, based on the architectural drawings they'd reviewed together. The frame was solid, the roof was on, and the concrete floor had been poured to perfection. But Sarah's body language suggested that the workshop was the least of her concerns at the moment. "Everything okay?" Jake asked as he approached, keeping his voice carefully neutral. Tommy had stayed home sick with a minor cold, which meant Jake could focus entirely on whatever crisis had reduced his normally composed student to tears. Sarah managed a shaky laugh that didn't fool anyone. "Just having one of those mornings where everything falls apart at once." Jake set down his toolbox and waited. He'd learned over the past few weeks that Sarah often needed a moment to organize her thoughts before she was ready to talk about whatever was bothering her. She was someone who was used to maintaining control, and admitting that control had slipped didn't come easily. "I got a call this morning from my law firm," Sarah said finally. "The partners have decided that my leave of absence is actually going to be permanent. They're buying out my share of the practice and suggesting I might be happier pursuing other opportunities." Jake felt his stomach drop. "They fired you?" "Technically, they made me an offer I couldn't refuse," Sarah said with bitter irony. "But yes, essentially they fired me. Apparently my recent absence has made them realize they can handle my caseload without me, and my requests for a reduced schedule and better work-life balance were seen as signs that I'm no longer committed to the firm's vision." Jake sat down on the lumber pile beside her, trying to process what this meant for their arrangement. Sarah had structured their agreement based on having 6 months away from her practice to focus on learning new skills. If that foundation had just been removed, he wasn't sure what happened next. "I'm sorry," Jake said, and meant it. "That must have come as a shock." Sarah nodded, staring out at the half-finished workshop. The worst part is that I'm not even sure I'm upset about losing the job. I'm more upset about what it says about me that they found me so easy to replace. Jake considered this for a moment. How many years did you work there? 8. I helped build that practice from 12 attorneys to 47. I brought in some of their biggest clients, won cases that other firms said were unwinnable, worked weekends and holidays and missed vacations because the work was always more important than anything else. And in 8 years, did you ever take a real break? Ever ask for time to focus on yourself? Sarah shook her head. Never. This was the first time I'd ever put my personal needs ahead of the firm's immediate requirements. Jake nodded slowly. Then maybe the problem isn't that you're easily replaceable. Maybe the problem is that you built a life where you were afraid to be irreplaceable as yourself instead of just as a worker. Sarah turned to look at him, surprised by the observation. What do you mean? I mean, maybe they didn't realize they could do without you because you never gave them the chance to miss you. You were always there, always available, always putting the job first. People don't value what they never have. To worry about losing. Sarah considered this, wiping away the last traces of tears from her cheeks. So you're saying I trained them to take me for granted? I'm saying you trained yourself to believe that your worth was entirely tied to how much you could sacrifice for other people's goals, Jake replied. And when you finally tried to reclaim some space for your own goals, they couldn't handle the idea that you might be a complete person instead of just a resource they could use. The observation hung in the air between them like sawdust settling after a long cut. Sarah had never articulated it quite that way, but Jake's words resonated with something she'd been feeling but couldn't name. The thing is, Sarah said slowly, I'm not even sure what my own goals are anymore. I got so used to defining success by external metrics that I forgot to ask myself what I actually wanted to accomplish. Jake stood up and walked over to examine the workshop's progress. The framing was solid and square, built by people who understood that precision in the foundation determined everything that came after. What did you want to accomplish when you decided to learn woodworking? Sarah joined him at the building's entrance, looking into the space that would soon become her workshop. I wanted to create something permanent with my own hands. Something that would exist because I made it, not because I negotiated it or argued for it or billed hours for it. And has that changed? Does losing the job change what you want to create? Sarah shook her head slowly. No. If anything, it makes it more important. I spent 8 years building someone else's vision of success, and I have almost nothing to show for it except money in the bank and skills that apparently aren't as irreplaceable as I thought. Jake nodded toward the workshop. So maybe losing the job isn't the worst thing that could have happened. Maybe it's just the universe clearing your schedule so you can focus on building something that actually belongs to you. Sarah smiled. For the first time since Jake had arrived. You know, for someone who stacks lumber for a living, you have some pretty insightful perspectives on career transitions. Stacking lumber teaches you a lot about foundations, Jake replied. You learn that if the bottom layer isn't solid and level, everything you build on top of it will eventually fall apart. Maybe your law career was built on a foundation that wasn't quite right for who you really are. Sarah walked into the workshop space, her footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. So, what now? I've got this beautiful workshop being built. I'm learning skills I love, but I no longer have the income that was supposed to support this transition. Jake had been wondering the same thing, though from a different angle. How long can you afford to continue without working? With the buyout money from the firm, plus what I've saved over the years, I could probably go a year without any income at all. Maybe longer if I'm careful about expenses. Jake felt relieved that the arrangement wouldn't necessarily end immediately, but he could see that Sarah's situation had fundamentally changed. The confidence that came from having a prestigious job and a clear career path had been replaced by uncertainty about what came next. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said. "Of course. What would you do if money wasn't a consideration? If you could spend the next year doing anything you wanted, what would that look like?" Sarah thought about the question as she examined the electrical rough-in that would power her tools and lighting. "I'd finish learning woodworking. I'd get good enough to build real furniture, maybe even take on custom commissions. I'd figure out what it feels like to be genuinely skilled at something that produces tangible results." She paused, running her hand along a wall stud. "And I think I'd want to find a way to help other people discover the same satisfaction I'm finding in this. There's something about working with your hands that connects you to yourself in a way that intellectual work never did for me." Jake felt a spark of recognition. Like teaching? Maybe. Or maybe just creating opportunities for people to learn skills they didn't know they wanted to develop. Sarah turned to face Jake directly. "What about you? If you could structure your life any way you wanted, what would that look like?" Jake considered the question seriously. "I'd want to do more work like this, teaching, custom projects, maybe building furniture for people who appreciate quality craftsmanship. I'd like Tommy to grow up seeing that work can be something you love instead of just something you endure." "What's stopping you from making that transition?" "The same thing that stops most people. I need steady income to support my family, and carpentry work is unpredictable. Some months are great, others are feast or famine. The lumber mill job isn't exciting, but it's reliable." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. What if it didn't have to be unpredictable? What if there was a way to build a carpentry business that had steady income and reliable clients? Jake shrugged. "I've thought about it, but I don't have the capital to invest in proper equipment or a real workshop. Most of my tools are borrowed or second-hand, and working out of my basement limits the size of projects I can take on." Sarah looked around the workshop space again, and Jake could almost see the wheels turning in her mind. "What if we approached this differently? Instead of me just learning woodworking and you just teaching it, what if we built something together?" "What do you mean?" Sarah's voice grew more animated as the idea took shape. "I've got capital but no skills. You've got skills but limited capital. I've got this workshop being built and no clear plan for what to do with it long term. What if we turned it into a legitimate business?" Jake felt intrigued, but cautious. "What kind of business?" "Custom furniture, restoration work, maybe teaching. Workshops for other people who want to learn. I handle the business side, you handle the craftsmanship. We split the profits based on contribution, and we both get to do work we actually care about." Jake walked around the workshop space, imagining it equipped with professional-grade tools and set up for serious production work. The idea was appealing, but he'd learned to be wary of opportunities that seemed too good to be true. "It's an interesting idea," Jake said carefully, "but business partnerships can get complicated, especially when one person is providing most of the capital." Sarah nodded. "You're right to be cautious. I've seen plenty of partnerships fall apart because the terms weren't clear from the beginning." She paused, thinking, what if we started small? Maybe just collaboration on specific projects, see how we work together before making any bigger commitments. Jake appreciated her willingness to start conservatively. "That makes sense. We could treat it like an extended apprenticeship for both of us. You learn advanced woodworking, I learn about running a business." "Exactly. And in the meantime, you keep your day job until we know whether this could actually work as a sustainable venture." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the electrical contractor, who needed to discuss outlet placement and circuit requirements. Jake and Sarah spent the next hour walking through the workshop plans with the electrician, making decisions about tool placement and power requirements that would affect how the space functioned for years to come. Jake found himself impressed by how thoughtfully Sarah approached each decision. She asked detailed questions about amperage requirements for different tools, insisted on extra circuits for future expansion, and positioned outlets for maximum flexibility rather than minimum. Cost. It was clear that she was thinking about the workshop not just as a place to learn a hobby, but as a serious working space that could support professional-level projects. "You're building this place like you intend to use it for real work," Jake observed as they finalized the electrical plan. "Because I do," Sarah replied. "Even if we don't end up as business partners, I want this workshop to be capable of producing professional quality work. There's no point in learning to do something halfway." After the electrician left, Jake and Sarah spent another hour discussing potential business models and project types. Sarah had clearly been thinking about this possibility for longer than she'd initially let on, and she had surprisingly detailed ideas about target markets and pricing strategies. "I've been researching custom furniture makers in the region," Sarah said, showing Jake notes she'd made on her phone. "There's definitely demand for high-quality work, but most of the established shops have waiting lists of 6 months or more. That suggests there's room for a new player who can deliver quality work on reasonable timelines." Jake nodded. "The trick is building a reputation without having an existing portfolio. Most people won't pay premium prices for custom work from someone they've never heard of." "That's where starting with smaller projects makes sense," Sarah said. "Build up a portfolio and client base gradually. Prove we can deliver what we promise before taking on bigger commissions." As they talked, Jake found himself getting genuinely excited about the possibilities. The combination of Sarah's business, acumen, and capital with his craftsmanship skills could potentially create something more substantial than either of them could achieve alone. But he also knew that successful partnerships required more than just complementary skills. "Can I ask you something personal?" Jake said. "Sure. Why do you want to do this? I mean, with the buyout money and your savings, you could probably start any kind of business you wanted. Why choose something that requires getting your hands dirty and learning skills from scratch?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Because for the first time in my adult life, I'm doing something just because I love it, not because it pays well or looks impressive on my resume or advances my career. I love the smell of wood shavings and the feeling of a sharp chisel cutting a clean joint. I love the problem-solving aspect of figuring out how pieces fit together." She paused, looking around the workshop space. "But more than that, I love learning from you and Tommy. I've spent 8 years in meetings with people who were either trying to impress me or intimidate me. Working with you feels like the first honest relationship I've had in years." Jake felt touched by the admission, but also aware of the responsibility it implied. "You know that going into business together could change that dynamic. Money has a way of complicating even good relationships." "I know," Sarah said. "That's why I want to be very careful about how we structure anything we do together. I don't want to lose what we've built as teacher and student." They spent the rest of the afternoon discussing practical details like equipment needs, workspace requirements, and potential project timelines. By the time Jake needed to leave to pick up Tommy from school, they had outlined a rough plan for testing their collaboration on a few small projects before making any major commitments. "I want to run this by Tommy," Jake said as he gathered his tools. "This affects his life too. And I've learned that 8-year-olds sometimes see things that adults miss." Sarah smiled. "I'd be interested to hear his perspective. He's been surprisingly insightful during our woodworking lessons." As Jake drove home, he found himself thinking about the unexpected direction his life was taking. 3 weeks ago, his biggest concern had been making rent and keeping food on the table. Now he was potentially looking at starting a business with someone who could provide the capital and support to make it successful. But more than the financial possibilities, Jake was excited about the prospect of doing work that mattered to him work that would allow him to use all of his skills and knowledge instead of just the small portion required for his current jobs. The idea of building a business with Sarah felt like the logical next step in a relationship that had already proven to be mutually beneficial. Tommy was waiting on the front steps of their apartment building when Jake arrived, looking much better than he had that morning. The cold that had kept him home from school seemed to have run its course, leaving him energetic and full of questions about the workshop's progress. "How's the building coming?" Tommy asked as they climbed the stairs to their apartment. "Did they finish the walls yet?" "Getting close," Jake said, "and I have something I want to talk to you about." Over dinner, Jake explained Sarah's situation with her law firm and the possibility of turning their woodworking arrangement into a legitimate business partnership. Tommy listened with the serious attention he usually reserved for important conversations about school or family decisions. "So Sarah lost her job?" Tommy asked. "She did. The people she worked with decided they didn't need her anymore." Tommy frowned. "That's not very nice. She's really smart, and she works really hard." "Sometimes being smart and working hard isn't enough," Jake said. "Sometimes the people you work with make decisions that don't make sense." "But now she wants to start a business with you?" "She's thinking about it. We'd work together building furniture and teaching other people woodworking. I'd do most of the actual building, and she'd handle the business parts, like finding customers and managing money." Tommy considered this while carefully eating his mac and cheese. "Would that mean you wouldn't have to work at the lumber mill anymore? Maybe eventually, but not right away. We'd start small and see how it goes. And I could still learn woodworking with you guys. Absolutely. In fact, you'd probably learn even more because we'd be doing more advanced projects." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "I think it's a good idea. Sarah needs something to do now that she doesn't have her old job, and you like building things way more than you like stacking lumber." Jake smiled at his son's straightforward analysis. "Anything else I should think about?" "Well," Tommy said seriously, "Sarah has been really sad since her old job people were mean to her. Maybe having a new job that she actually likes would help her feel better." Jake was struck by his son's perceptive observation. Tommy had picked up on something that Jake had noticed but hadn't fully articulated. Sarah's enthusiasm for woodworking wasn't just about learning new skills. It was about finding work that felt meaningful after years of professional disappointment. "You're right about that, buddy. I think this could be good for all of us." That evening, after Tommy had gone to bed, Jake called Sarah to continue their conversation about potential collaboration. She answered on the first ring, sounding more energetic than she had that morning. "I've been thinking about our conversation today," Sarah said. "I really want to try working together, but I want to make sure we do it right." "What did you have in mind?" "I think we should start with one specific project, something substantial enough to test how we work together, but not so big that we're committing to a long-term partnership before we know how compatible we are." Jake agreed with the approach. "What kind of project?" "I've been looking at custom and dining tables online," Sarah said. "There's definitely demand for quality work, and a dining table would showcase both craftsmanship and design skills. Plus, it's the kind of piece that could lead to other commissions if we do good work." "That's a solid choice. Big enough to be challenging, but not so complex that it's overwhelming for someone still learning advanced techniques." "I'm thinking we could build one for my house first," Sarah continued. "That way we can work out any issues with our collaboration without the pressure of a paying client. If it goes well, we can use it as a portfolio piece to attract real customers." Jake found the proposal both reasonable and exciting. A custom dining table would require skills he'd been wanting to develop, and working with Sarah's capital would allow them to use high-quality materials and take the time necessary to do the work properly. "I'm interested," Jake said. "When would we start?" As soon as the workshop is finished, probably another 2 weeks, Jake felt a familiar excitement building, the same feeling he'd had as a child when presented with a challenging project that would push his skills to new levels. All right, let's build a dining table. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Sarah threw herself into researching table designs and wood species with the same intensity she'd once brought to legal research. Jake found himself sketching joint details and calculating lumber requirements during breaks at the mill, mentally, rehearsing techniques he'd only read about in woodworking magazines. Tommy's cold resolved quickly, and he resumed his position as eager apprentice during their regular lessons. His excitement about the upcoming table project was infectious, and Jake found that explaining complex concepts to an 8-year-old helped clarify his own understanding of the work they were about to undertake. The workshop was completed on a Thursday morning in late November, and Jake arrived that afternoon to find Sarah standing in the middle of the space with an expression of pure joy on her face. The building had been transformed from a construction site into a fully functional workshop with natural light streaming through strategically placed windows and enough electrical capacity to run any tool they might need. "It's perfect," Sarah said as Jake walked through the space. "Even better than I imagined." Jake had to agree. The workshop was beautifully designed and expertly built, with ample space for large projects and thoughtful details like dust collection, systems and climate control that would protect both tools and materials. It was the kind of workspace that any craftsman would be thrilled to use. "When do we start building furniture?" Tommy asked, having come along to see the completed workshop. Jake and Sarah looked at each other and smiled. "How about tomorrow?" Sarah said. 6 months later, Jake stood in the doorway of what had once been Sarah's guest bedroom, now converted into an office space where order forms and client consultations filled filing cabinets that had previously held legal documents. The transformation was complete, but it hadn't happened the way any of them had expected. Their first dining table project had been a revelation. Working together in Sarah's beautiful workshop, Jake had discovered that his student possessed not just enthusiasm, but genuine talent for understanding wood grain and joint construction. Sarah had surprised herself by developing an intuitive feel for proportion and design that complemented Jake's technical expertise perfectly. The walnut dining table they'd built had been stunning enough that Sarah's neighbor, Dr. Patricia Vance, had commissioned a matching sideboard before the original piece was even finished. Word had spread through the affluent community surrounding Sarah's mountain home, and within 3 months they had a waiting list of clients willing to pay premium prices for custom furniture. But success had brought unexpected challenges that tested their partnership in ways neither had anticipated. "Jake, we need to talk about the Morrison Commission," Sarah called from her desk, where she was reviewing material costs for an entertainment center they'd been asked to build. "Mrs. Morrison wants to change the wood species again, and it's the 3rd revision this week." Jake walked over to examine the latest sketches, noting the increasingly elaborate modifications that had transformed a simple bookcase design into something that would require nearly twice their original time estimate. "At some point, we need to explain that constant changes affect both timeline and pricing." "I've tried," Sarah said, frustration evident in her voice, "but she's offering to pay a 20% premium for the modifications, and I'm having trouble saying no to money that could help us expand the business." This was the heart of their current dilemma. Success had created opportunities they hadn't planned for, but it had also revealed fundamental differences in how they approached business decisions. Sarah, despite her stated desire to prioritize craftsmanship over profit, still had reflexes from her legal career that pushed her toward maximizing revenue. Jake, meanwhile, found himself increasingly protective of the quality and integrity of their work. "The problem isn't the money," Jake said, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "The problem is That if we keep accepting changes that compromise our design standards, we'll end up building furniture we're not proud of for clients who don't respect our expertise. Sarah set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. You're right, I know you're right, but turning down paying work still feels wrong to me, even when the work itself doesn't feel right. Jake understood her conflict. After being unexpectedly forced out of her legal career, Sarah had developed an anxiety about financial security that sometimes overrode her stated commitment to maintaining their standards. It was understandable, but it was creating tension that threatened to undermine everything they'd built together. What if we approached it differently? Jake suggested. Instead of saying no to Mrs. Morrison, what if we explained that her modifications would work better as a completely separate piece? We could complete the bookcase as originally designed, then discuss a custom entertainment center as a future project. Sarah's expression brightened. That way, we maintain the integrity of the current project while still being responsive to her evolving needs. Exactly. And it establishes us as craftsmen who care about getting things right rather than just service providers who do whatever the client requests. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the workshop door opening and Tommy's voice calling out that he was home from school. At 9 years old now, Tommy had become an integral part of their operation, arriving each afternoon to work on his own projects while Jake and Sarah tackled their commissioned pieces. How did the presentation go? Sarah asked as Tommy appeared in the office doorway, still wearing his school backpack. Tommy's face lit up with pride. I got an A+. Mrs. Johnson said my birdhouse was the most professional-looking project anyone had ever brought to show and tell. Jake felt a warm satisfaction that had nothing to do with business success. Watching Tommy develop genuine skills and confidence in woodworking had been one of the unexpected benefits of their partnership with Sarah. His son was learning not just techniques but standards, understanding that excellence was achieved through patience and attention to detail rather than shortcuts and compromises. Can I work on my tool chest today? Tommy asked, referring to the project he'd been developing with increasing independence over the past month. After homework, Jake said automatically. But yes, I think you're ready to start cutting the dovetails for the corners. Tommy pumped his fist in celebration before heading to the kitchen table that served as his homework station. Hand-cut dovetails represented a significant milestone in woodworking skill development, and Tommy had been working toward this moment for weeks. Sarah watched Tommy disappear around the corner, then turned back to Jake with a thoughtful expression. He's gotten really good at this, better than some adults I've seen trying to learn woodworking. Kids learn fast when they're genuinely interested, Jake replied. Plus, he's been around tools and wood his whole life. It's starting to feel natural to him. Have you thought about what happens when he gets older? Will he want to keep working with us, or will he develop other interests? Jake had been wondering the same thing. Tommy's enthusiasm for woodworking showed no signs of diminishing, but 9-year-olds were notoriously changeable in their passions. I think as long as we don't pressure him, he'll stick with it. He genuinely loves the problem-solving aspect and the satisfaction of creating something useful. Speaking of creating something useful, Sarah said, returning to the stack of paperwork on her desk, I've been thinking about the offer from Hendrix Design Group. Jake felt his stomach tighten slightly. The offer from Hendrix represented a significant opportunity, but also a potential turning point that could fundamentally change their operation. The design firm wanted to subcontract their high-end furniture needs to Jake and Sarah's workshop, guaranteeing steady work and substantial income in exchange for exclusivity agreements and adherence to Hendrix design specifications. What's your current thinking? Jake asked. The guaranteed income would solve our cash flow uncertainty, Sarah said. No more worrying about whether we'll have enough projects to pay our expenses, but it would also mean giving up control over our design decisions and client relationships. Jake had been wrestling with the same trade-offs. The Hendricks offer represented financial security, but creative limitation. They would become skilled manufacturers rather than designers and craftsmen, executing other people's visions rather than developing their own aesthetic voice. Would we still be able to take on independent commissions? Jake asked. Limited ones. The exclusivity clause would prevent us from working with any of Hendricks' existing or potential clients, which basically means anyone in the luxury market within a 200-mile radius. Jake walked to the window that overlooked their workshop, where afternoon sunlight was illuminating the Walnut Entertainment Center they were currently building for a couple in Denver. The piece represented everything he loved about their work: challenging joinery, beautiful materials, and a design that perfectly suited the client's needs and aesthetic preferences. "What does your gut tell you?" Jake asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "My gut tells me that we didn't go through everything we've been through just to end up working for someone else again. But my head tells me that financial security is more important than creative satisfaction." "And what does your heart tell you?" Sarah smiled at the question. "My heart tells me that 6 months ago I was miserable despite having financial security, and now I'm happier than I've been in years, despite having uncertainty." Jake nodded, feeling his own clarity emerging. The Hendricks deal feels like going backward, taking the safe path instead of building something that's genuinely ours. But what if we can't sustain the business long term? What if the market changes, or we can't find enough clients willing to pay our rates? "Then we'll figure out something else," Jake said, with more confidence than he entirely felt. "But at least we'll fail while trying to build something we believe in, rather than succeeding at something that doesn't matter to us." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the workshop door. Jake looked out to see a man in an expensive suit standing beside a luxury sedan, clearly out of place in their mountain workshop setting. "Are you expecting someone?" Sarah asked. Jake shook his head, but something about the visitor's posture suggested this wasn't a potential client making an inquiry. There was an officiousness to the way the man stood that reminded Jake of process servers and tax collectors. When Jake opened the workshop door, the man immediately handed him a business card and launched into what was clearly a rehearsed presentation. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Robert Chen from Pinnacle Legal Services. I represent Hendricks Design Group in their acquisition negotiations." Jake felt Sarah tense beside him. Acquisition negotiations. Hendricks has decided that rather than subcontracting your services, they'd prefer to acquire your operation entirely. They're prepared to make a very generous offer for your workshop, client list, and exclusive rights to your services for the next 5 years. Sarah stepped forward, her legal training evidently kicking in. "We haven't expressed any interest in selling our business." "Of course not," Chen replied smoothly. "But Hendricks believes that once you see the terms they're offering, you'll recognize this as an exceptional opportunity for financial security and professional growth." He handed Sarah a thick envelope. "Everything is detailed in there. Purchase, price, employment contracts, performance bonuses. I think you'll find the numbers quite compelling." After Chen left, Jake and Sarah sat in the workshop office reading through the acquisition proposal in stunned silence. The financial terms were indeed compelling, offering more money than either of them had imagined their 6-month-old business could be worth. "They want to pay us $2 million, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For a business we started 6 months ago with a broken-down truck and some hand tools," Jake added, still trying to process the numbers. The proposal outlined a 5-year employment agreement that would guarantee substantial salaries for both Jake and Sarah, plus performance bonuses tied to production targets and client satisfaction scores. It was the kind of financial security that could transform not just their own lives, but Tommy's future prospects as well. $2 million would pay for Tommy's college education and leave enough for us to start something new after the 5-year commitment, Jake said. It would also mean spending the next 5 years building other people's designs according to other people's specifications, Sarah replied. They spent the next hour analyzing every detail of the proposal, trying to understand both the opportunities and the limitations it represented. Hendrix clearly valued their craftsmanship skills and client relationships, but they also wanted complete control over design decisions and business operations. "It's a golden cage," Sarah said finally. "Beautiful, comfortable, and completely restrictive." Jake nodded, thinking about Tommy's excitement over his tool chest project and the satisfaction he'd felt watching his son develop genuine skills and confidence. Would Tommy still be able to work with us under this arrangement? Sarah scanned through the employment terms. There's nothing explicitly prohibiting it, but the production targets and scheduling requirements would make it difficult to maintain the kind of family atmosphere we have now. That evening, Jake, Sarah and Tommy gathered around the kitchen table to discuss the Hendrix offer. Jake had learned that including Tommy in important family decisions usually led to insights that adults missed, and this decision would affect Tommy's life as much as anyone's. "So they want to buy our business?" Tommy asked after Jake explained the situation in terms a 9-year-old could understand. "They want to buy the right to tell us what to build and how to build it," Sarah clarified. "We'd still do the actual woodworking, but we wouldn't get to choose our own projects anymore." Tommy frowned. "Would I still be able to make my own projects?" "Probably not as much," Jake admitted. "We'd be working longer hours on their projects, which wouldn't leave as much time for teaching and experimenting." "And would we still own our tools and workshop?" "Technically, yes, but we'd have to use them for their work instead of our own work." Tommy considered this seriously. "So it's like if someone offered to buy my bike, but I could only ride it where they wanted me to go." Jake and Sarah exchanged glances, impressed by the accuracy of the analogy. "That's exactly what it's like," Sarah said. "That doesn't sound like a very good deal," Tommy concluded. "Even if they offered a lot of money for my bike, I wouldn't want it if I couldn't ride it where I wanted to go." Jake felt his decision crystallizing around his son's simple wisdom. "You're right, buddy. Some things are more valuable than money." Sarah nodded slowly. "I've spent too many years working for other people's dreams. I don't want to go back to that, even for $2 million. The next morning, Jake called Robert Chen to decline Hendrix's acquisition offer. Chen seemed genuinely surprised by the decision and pressed Jake to reconsider, suggesting that opportunities like this rarely came along twice. "Maybe not," Jake replied, "but we're more interested in building something sustainable than something profitable." After Jake hung up, he found Sarah in the workshop, putting finishing touches on the entertainment center they'd been building. She looked up from her sanding with a smile that contained equal parts relief and determination. "Any regrets?" Jake asked. "None," Sarah said firmly. "For the first time in my adult life, I'm exactly where I want to be, doing exactly what I want to do, with people I actually care about. That's worth more than any amount of money Hendrix could have offered." Jake picked up his own sandpaper and joined her in the methodical work of preparing the wood for its final finish. The repetitive motion was meditative, creating space for reflection on how dramatically their lives had changed since that rainy night when Sarah's car had broken down on Route 47. "You know what I realized?" Sarah said as they worked. 6 months ago, I thought success meant having other people need you, but I've learned that real success means needing yourself, trusting your own judgment and abilities enough to build something that reflects who you actually are." Jake nodded, thinking about the satisfaction he felt each evening when he looked at the day's progress on whatever project they were building. And teaching Tommy that work can be something you love instead of something you endure. Tommy appeared in the workshop doorway, having finished his homework and eager to continue work on his tool chest. "Can I start cutting my dovetails now?" "Go get your tools," Jake said, watching his son's face light up with anticipation. As Tommy carefully set up his workspace with the precision he'd learned from months of practice, Jake felt a deep contentment that had nothing to do with financial success or professional achievement. This workshop, this partnership with Sarah, this opportunity to pass on meaningful skills to his son, represented the kind of wealth that couldn't be bought or sold or acquired by outside investors. Sarah finished sanding the entertainment center's final panel and stepped back to admire their work. "You know what the best part is?" "What's that?" "We built this. Not just the furniture, but everything. The business, the partnership, the life we're living. Nobody handed it to us or bought it for us or designed it for us. We created it ourselves, one project at a time." Jake looked around the workshop at the tools hanging in their designated places, the lumber stacked according to species and grade, the workbenches worn smooth by months of use. Everything in this space had been chosen deliberately, arranged thoughtfully, and maintained with care. "And we get to keep building it," Jake said, watching Tommy carefully mark his dovetail layout, with the concentration of someone who understood that precision mattered. 3 years later, Tommy would present a college admissions essay about learning that wealth meant having work that fed your soul rather than just your bank account. Sarah would expand their workshop into a teaching center where other professionals could discover the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with their own hands. And Jake would finally understand that fixing Sarah's truck that rainy night hadn't just been about helping a stranded motorist. It had been about finding the missing pieces of their own lives. But that afternoon, as they worked together in their mountain workshop with sunlight streaming through the windows and wood shavings curling away from sharp tools, none of them were thinking about the future. They were entirely present in the moment, absorbed in the ancient satisfaction of turning raw materials into something useful and beautiful through skill, patience, and care. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, but inside the workshop it was warm and bright and filled with the quiet sounds of people doing work they loved. And that, Jake realized, was exactly what happiness sounded like. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.